Hey, everybody, welcome back to the ninth and final installment of the Authentic Media Masters of the Air episode recap. Roger again here with Boyle. Boyle, how are you tonight?
I'm doing great, but it's very bittersweet that this is the ninth and final episode that we're discussing.
It is. It really is. I'm going to miss doing this every week. I'm going to miss watching the show. And so I guess that tells you,
Yeah.
spoiler alert, Roger feels somewhat redeemed by this last episode, but we'll save that for later. We're just going to jump right in because it was a longer episode than usual, and we'll probably end up talking a little longer than usual. Uh, and as we normally do, we'll just start with a short recap of the episode to sort of set the conditions of
Yeah.
what we're talking about historically. So, not really in chronological order, but starting with the beginning. Rosie gets shot down, right?
He does.
By Flak. No more fighters, but there's Flak. And he ends up, we'll talk about the historical accuracy, but he ends up nursing his plane to where exactly?
So just into across into Soviet lines, so
Mhm.
just to the east of Berlin, which is where their target was. As kind of the Soviets were coming in from the east and the Allies were coming in from the west, but the Soviets were on the knocking on the doorstep of Berlin, even as early as February.
Right. And we'll talk about that in the history section. And he is, of course, rescued or links up with the Soviets, lands in no man's land and links up with the Soviets, avoids being shot, which is
Yeah,
not what's the, not implausible that in the heat of battle, you don't look like me, you're going to get shot.
that's exactly right.
And he does go through a bit of a lengthy return process. We don't see all of
hmm
it. We hear about some of it. We see some of it. And of course, he gets back in time for VE or Victory in Europe Day.
Yep.
Uh, we are seeing the Buck and Bucky in Stalag Luft III and beyond. We see them go through a series of camps, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk
Yep.
about their forced marches and the escape. We'll talk about how history and the show are similar and different. Talk about particularly Stalag Luft VIIa, which got, I think, a little title card, but that's the final Stalag Luft.
It is.
And then we come back to Thorpe Abbott's and we see Crosby, and we'll talk a little bit about that and what was going on at the beginning that wasn't completely explained. Rosie's return, Operation Chow Hound, and maybe talk a little bit about why that even happened, because it's sort of a nice tie-in with another one of these series.
It is, and it was really interesting for them to bring this aspect
Yeah.
of it. A very little heard of, operation that
Mhm.
happened there at the tail end of the war.
Yeah, and one that I think we'll discuss was probably very cathartic in a lot of ways for the
Yeah,
guys. But we'll get
yeah.
there, and then of course we get to VE Day. So that's the thumbnail recap of the episode, and let's just jump right in. So let's talk about
Okay.
Rosie. And yes, the skies have been cleared of the Luftwaffe by and large. Uh, no more. I won't say no more. There was never no more. But you're not seeing the expertin, if you will, Luftwaffe pilots coming up, leading large formations and shooting down B-17s and B-24s in droves. But you still have Flak. Flak is a danger till the last day of the war, and that's actually what gets Rosie in this case.
It is, and I thought they did an excellent job. This whole sequence with Rosie, I thought was absolutely phenomenal. It showed, as you hear the voiceover from Crosby, that they are now the masters of the air,
Hmm.
and it's just teaming with American steel as far as the eye can
Hmm.
see, and the nice touches of it's no longer the green kind of camouflage paint
Hmm.
that had stopped in January 44, or the production of that when they came off the production line in January 44. So certainly by this point of the war, it's all silver,
Hmm.
bright, shiny aluminum silver airplanes. But right, flak was still a problem. I thought we were going to get an ME-262 in
I
there
was thinking the
as
same
well,
thing. Yeah.
which for the listeners, if they don't know, was really the first combat jet aircraft and was kind of the wonder weapons that Hitler was proposing along with the V1s and V2s and others. Very complicated piece of machinery, and certainly caught the Allies a bit by surprise.
Hmm.
And it could do some damage, but there just weren't enough of them, and the Allies were able to take him out mainly on the ground,
Right.
and able to
Whole
survive that.
fascinating methodology. We got a little time. Why don't we hit it just really quickly? I mean, here we go down on one of our tangents, but
There we go.
yeah. So as you said, a piece of technology that really was beyond where the Allies were. Swept wings before we were even thinking about it. What, we didn't get there till the F-86 maybe, just before Korea.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's right.
very hard hitting 30 millimeter cannon, as you said, a lot destroyed on the ground or very near to the ground. We learned very quickly that the best way to take these on was to exploit their low range or high fuel burn, I guess is a better way of saying it.
That's right.
And
But that thing could just come roaring out of the sky, plug away at some bombers. But again, because it's so complicated, you needed competent pilots to be able to fly it. And so they're able to, what the Luftwaffe does is they pull as many experienced pilots as they can. But even those pilots know, hey, the game is up here. This is the last desperate throw that really isn't going to make, although may make a splash, will certainly be exciting, will not make a difference in the war effort. And as they throw younger and less experienced pilots in there, they pay the price. And there's all kinds of stats about, in the last year and a half, the Luftwaffe lost more pilots to training accidents than they did to combat, just because they're so few hours. Their training regimen was terrible by this point, and they're just chucking people into aircraft and throwing them into combat as fast as they possibly can.
Right. And there were some pure air-to-air victories over the jets. I think Chuck Yeager, notably, is one of the bigger names that gets an air-to-air kill. But by and large, we would sort of camp, we being the American U.S. Army Air Corps fighters, would camp over the jet airfields and wait for them to come into land or to take off when they'd be vulnerable. So much so to the point that the Germans established top cover of conventional fighters, usually the TA-152 version of the Focke-Wulf 190, and they're sort of cool. I'll try and find a picture and put one up if you've ever seen the undersides, which were candy striped red and white, just like, hey, don't shoot down this, piston engine fighter. We're good guys for the Germans. But yeah, so Rosie gets shot down. While we're on the Silver Forts, I will say, production wise, I was surprised they didn't take the time to CGI at least the G models, which were prevalent by this part of the war, which is not. It's not a big story arc. It's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. It's just one of those little details that I saw so much of in the beginning of the show. I was like, oh, that's a little weird.
Yeah, and I wasn't able to figure out, although I tried to figure out, okay, what model was the 100th flying at this point? So maybe that is, I'd be very surprised if they got that wrong, right?
Yeah.
Given how much attention to detail the production team has put into it and how spot on it's been the entire
right. So we talked last time about the difference between a military historian and a war historian, which I guess makes me the detail nerd on this one. So I dug in and I can decisively say the 100th had G models at this point in the war, but that doesn't mean they didn't have F models still without the turret, right? I do believe though that there was never an F model delivered in bare metal, to the best of my knowledge, because of when the switchover happened. So, but we're going way down one of my nerd rabbit holes here. So, anyway, Rosie gets shot down. He hurts his arm, but they never really say exactly what. What did he do to it?
So this is actually the second time he's been shot down. So the first time was on September 10th, 1944, over France, as the Allies are kind of pushing through and getting ready to move into Germany proper. And he gets shot down there, crashes. He breaks his right arm in that first crash, and his nose is quickly picked up by the Allies and sent back to Thorpe Abbotts, where he recuperates, recovers, is kind of put in he goes into the ops shop where Crosby is doing planning and whatnot. And then, is told like, hey, you're just going to do this desk job. And he, kind of fights his way back into the cockpit. So here he is on this mission, shot down again, and he lands on his same arm that he had broken before. So that's what happens when we see him hit the ground pretty hard, and he's broken his arm, and that's what's happened.
And is the depiction there accurate in terms of it was truly no man's land, and it could have gone either way?
That's exactly right. And how they depicted it was exactly how it's been
Wow.
described by Rosie himself, um, about kind of the conditions that he, jumped into this foxhole, tried to get his gun out, had to get it out with his left hand. And then when the Soviet soldiers come up, they're about ready to shoot him. And he's shouting,
Yeah.
Amerikansky, Stalin, Roosevelt, Coca-Cola,
Yeah.
whatever American word he can get out of his mouth that is popping into his
Yeah.
head, he is shouting it, and then they finally lower their guns and then take him away, as depicted. It was very, very accurate as described by Rosie himself.
That's great. I'm glad they got that right, because it's pretty dramatic, and it's good to hear that was real. And
It is.
Go ahead.
No, and including him grabbing the controls, everybody else getting out, the plane spinning out of control, him being pinned back by the G-forces of a spinning plane. All of that was spot on.
That's awesome. And for people, the common, I think, vision of the Soviets in the U.S. is, okay, we link up at the Elbe, and there's the great controversy on why we didn't go to Berlin. And, well, wait, so why is he so close to the lines? Well, the air war is, of course, progressing over the front lines and beyond the front lines. So you start to get this intermesh, and there's this very colorful, though potentially apocryphal, story of a flight of P-38s in the last month or two of the war that get jumped by some Soviet Lavochkins. I think it might have been Yaks, immaterial. And what I thought was interesting was the Soviets jumped the Americans. The Americans realized they were Soviets, but after they got engaged, they fought back, and some planes are shot down on both sides. And when the Soviets found out what happened, they executed the flight commander of their flight. Like, you just shot down Americans. They've never seen a P-38, right? Of all the planes out there, this is probably the Western plane that's going to look the most like one of these forward-leaning German designs, right? I can see why this is happening. But then they came back and said, hey, we executed our guy. You need to execute your guy. And, of course, it was like, we're done. We're not going to do that here.
That is a technique for leadership technique.
Yes.
Again, not the one that we follow in the U.S., but it is there.
Yeah, it's there. It's an option. I'll see if I could find, as we're editing this, see if I can find the detail and put it maybe a screen capture in there or something.
Gotcha.
But he, meaning Rosie now, is rescued by the Soviets, and he's got the translator. And for me, it was a very accurate, from everything I've ever read about the Eastern Front, depiction of, okay, there's going to be a senior officer there because you're an American flyer, and we're going to have the junior officer who's a translator. I assume accurate. They've done everything else accurately.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, and that was, again, described by Rosie himself, that's kind of how he was picked up and then shuttled to a nearby airfield and then flown to Moscow. And then we hear him talk about his return, which we'll talk about here in a second.
Right. And on the way, though, he sees they stop at or blocked by some sort of problem on the road outside a concentration camp, a relatively small one. Mm-hmm. And let's talk about this, because in the show, when I looked in the show notes, it's representing something called concentration camp or Konzentrationslager Posen or Fort 7.
Okay.
And I don't know if that's truly where he was or not.
It may have been just by geography. And Rosie, he never talked about this. The only thing he mentioned to people, and this is now secondhand, people saying like he saw a camp, and he only would say that, yeah, I saw a camp, and then he never ever spoke about it. And then when he's kind of repatriated back to England, and we'll talk about the conversation that he and Crosby have. That's what he would say, was like they got what's coming to them based off of what I've seen. And he would just say, I saw a camp. Yeah. Whether it was this one or not, I think is immaterial, but he did go into one.
Yeah, and it would make sense based on where he was shot down. But to your point, I think it's immaterial. I think it's, in my mind, completely understandable, especially because he felt such a personal connection, right?
That's right.
From his own faith to what was going on there. And, I've I was at Abu Ghraib several times, and if for people who don't know the history, Saddam Hussein conducted mass executions at Abu Ghraib. I've been to the killing fields in Cambodia. I've never been to any of the camps in Germany, but anywhere from 4 or 5 in the case of Abu Ghraib to 30 or 40 years later, those places still have an air to them. So I can only imagine weeks potentially, right? It's potentially been weeks since, or days since these things have been happening. So really understandable to me why he isn't talking about them, doesn't know how to talk about them. And it made me think about, I think it was Eisenhower who said, we must document this because people simply will not believe it.
That's exactly right, because people, and that's what we see, Rosie's reaction to it as the audience member, as we're going through this with him. People have heard about this. There are, strong rumors about it, but the scope and scale, no one can fathom. You just can't fathom it.
Right.
And until you've seen it, like Rosie sees it, and God bless the actor who portrayed him, because you can see the range of emotions that he is going through with it. Disgust, horror, sadness, anger, all of it with that. And as you say, Roger, that was Eisenhower's reaction. No one will believe what we say. We must absolutely document this.
Right. So I agree. Kudos to the actor for very nuanced acting and really bringing, with no words, just bringing that emotion out.
That's exactly right.
It was hard to watch for me, even.
Oh, yeah.
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 So, but moving on from that, how do you move on from that? But of course, Rosie had to, and we will as well. So he returns via a sort of neat route through the Middle East, which I think is really cool, because let's just touch on it for a second. There's a whole area of the war that never, ever gets mentioned.
That's right.
And so he goes from Moscow to, is it Iraq? Is he in Iraq?
Tehran.
Tehran. That's right. Mm-hmm. So even further, so Iran, and then over to Crody. Is it?
Crody, I think. Then somehow gets to Italy.
Yeah.
And then to Naples, and then gets on Churchill's private B-24.
Right. Which I'm gonna put a photo in here, and I honestly didn't know about that, right? I for all my little geekdom on the aircraft and ships and so on and so forth, I've never been like, oh, what was and I looked up. It's pretty cool. It's a modified B-24.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll put a note or something. It mysteriously, clearly without Churchill on board, was lost in the last weeks of the war over the Atlantic. Never a trace found. No idea whatever happened to it. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that was the fate of that aircraft.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
So, in any case, Rosie comes back, and that's a nice transition for us now to talk about the POWs. So Bucky, and they're in Stalag Luft III just for a little bit, and we had talked last time about, well, it's going to be one of three things. It's going to be a forced march. And they give them, how long? Not much time.
They gave him 30 minutes, and that's pretty accurate. What I've read in Don Miller's book, he said they had an hour. Again, I think immaterial, the number of minutes.
Yeah.
You don't have a lot of time to grab your stuff. But as you said, they've been preparing for it, and we see kind of a sequence of them getting their gear together, quickly assembling little kind of sleighs that they can pull supplies and equipment behind them as they kind of muster out and get ready for this march.
Right. And so why leave? Why are the Germans so intent on leaving the camp as the Allies approach with the prisoners?
First, they don't want, these are their prisoners, and they don't want to give them up. And it's the Soviets who are approaching where this camp is, and so they want to move them out of the way so the Soviets cannot rescue them. And maybe there's some weird calculus like, hey, if they take these, tens of thousands of POWs we have, then that's just more manpower that we're giving back to the Allies with that. And then the other piece is, we don't want any bit of material to fall into the Soviet hands. And you can see as everybody's falling out of their cabins and whatnot, the guards are right behind them with torches, lighting the place on fire, so that absolutely nothing is left for the advancing Soviet army to take advantage of.
Yeah. And so they have what's on their back and what they can carry and what they can put in the sleds. And of course, it's, Central and Northern Germany is not a hospitable place in the winter.
Yeah.
And off they go, and it's tough. And we see a moment of very human connection, right? And
We do.
if anyone, I'll let you describe it, because if people, it was a relatively new and relatively minor character. So if you didn't know the background, there's a little depth of that writing which I really like there. If you want to describe
I did
that.
too. Yeah, and if we remember from, I think one of the first POW camp episodes, not when Bucky arrives, but I think the following episode, and there is kind of the threat that the SS may come and hey, they need to report how many, Jewish airmen there are, and the reply is, we're all Americans,
Yeah.
and that's it. So we know that there are Jewish Americans there in the camp, and then as they're exiting the camp, one is highlighted, and a buddy asks him, "Hey, how you doing?" And he goes, "Hey, I'm doing great for a Jew going for a walk in Nazi Germany at night."
Yeah.
Kind of joking, and then this altercation happens, or not altercation, but event happens where you see one of the SS who's not looking well, not doing great with the cold weather, and he kind of falls down, and they could have left. If they'd kept on walking, he would have fallen over, got hypothermia, and died. But instead, one of the POWs picks him up, and it's revealed to be this Jewish airman is the one, so the irony there is, it's the humanity that transcends, and rather than kind of stoop to their level, he is still going to act like a human being.
Right. And there are just some things, like you said, that transcend.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a great moment that showed one of the big differences in what each side is fighting for. Not to cast aspersions on any one individual, but just, this is sort of the American way. We don't always get it right. We're not political here. We're not trying to take that. But, I thought that was a great moment right there.
Yep.
But we're on the night march, and then I had the question for you, as we've talked about much before. You've read the book and I have not. The night strafing of their not convoy, of their column. So
That's right.
Plausible to me it happened. Not sure I believe it was a P-51.
Yeah, don't know if it was a P-51. Could have been. But those kind of attacks did happen.
Yeah.
Because there they are. They've got lights and torches. And, you've got British and American fighters that are just patrolling, waiting for something to pop up and attack. And that's what they did. And there's no way to ID it with the technology. You've got your Mark 1 Mod 0 eyeball, and that's it.
Right.
And you see a column of people. Maybe you can notice one of the guards, like, oh, they have a weapon? Well, that's, game on. And it's not in Allied territory. So, let's attack it.
Right. And so some chaos is caused there, and I was fully expecting an attempted escape at that point.
I was too.
Right. And we'll get to why right here in a minute, why neither you nor I knew exactly when the escape was going to happen in the series.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, and Buck is a little reluctant still at this point to go. Again, showcasing what it's like, okay, we're so close to the end. What's the right play here?
That's exactly
if we run, they will try and kill us. If we go along, are they going to try and kill us? What's going to happen? And they make it to Stalag VIII. Notice no Luft on the end of that.
That's right.
So that's a big deal. Why is that a big deal?
Because we've discussed before, the Stalag Lufts, those were manned by Luftwaffe police or Luftwaffe soldiers. And again, there was the attitude of, well, we're going to treat these POWs that we've captured as well as we can because we want the Allies to reciprocate that kind of treatment to our downed airmen. And that was something that Hermann Goering had really pushed. But when you get to a regular style, your normal POW camp, where, and that is not the case. The conditions are much, much worse.
And it's in Nuremberg, which is just symbolically, I think it's true. That's where it was, but symbolically, this is okay. This is where everything is going to culminate with really sort of justice as much justice as there can be for
That's
something
right.
this horrific of the Second
Yeah.
World War. So that was interesting to me. It's not an editorial touch because it actually happened, but
Yeah.
interesting how life can have such syncope at sometimes. But
Yeah.
in any case, they're not there very long. They embark on another march, and I thought it was really interesting to see the senior American officer say, "We're doing." I don't remember if it's 20 miles. I think it's 20 miles, not kilometers. We're doing 20 miles, and that's it. We're
Yeah.
done. We're not doing more than that tonight. And I think most people have this vision of a prison camp like almost like a concentration camp, or like what people may have experienced in Korea or Vietnam or in the Japanese camps, but it's much more nuanced here, especially at the end of the war.
It is, and he does say kilometers, because Zoe and I had a discussion about like, well, how far is
How
that?
far is that? Okay.
Exactly. And I said, honey, I'm a war historian, not a mathematician, so
Right.
it's less than 20 miles.
Right. So, well, Navy
metric
math,
system.
right? A nautical mile is 2,000 yards, which is about
Yeah.
2,000 meters. So my quick public school math is it's about half a mile is a kilometer, but that's not exact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I thought that was interesting where he goes, I told them 20 kilometers and no more. And then there's some other interactions that he has. And I thought that was a nice, at least what I picked up was a nice nuance of he now has more leverage as the war is coming to a close. Although the Germans are still their captors, I think in the German mind, like, well, we know the end is near, and let's try and have as cordial of a guard prisoner relationship as we possibly can for when the end comes,
Right.
because everyone knows, except for a few fanatics, right? Everyone else knows that the end is coming.
Right. And you had mentioned earlier, of course, the Russians are who's closing in on this side of the country. And, let's go to the exact polar opposite of Masters of the Air. If anyone remembers the old show Hogan's Heroes, what was always the punishment for Sergeant Schultz? Eastern Front,
That's right.
But that was real. That, German soldiers would be like, I do not want to go to the Eastern Front. It was, there's so much you could say about the Eastern Front. And I think part of what's going into this relationship is that most of the Germans, including the SS at this point, realized I really want the Americans to think favorably of me, at least as much as possible, because there's at least a little trust of the Western Allies in the just sheer barbarity on both sides. Not to say it didn't happen in the West, and I know there were incidents, but the sheer barbarity in the East, the Germans did not want to be captured by the Russians.
Yeah,
And,
that's exactly
and
right.
in fact, you see the Western Front collapse relatively quickly at the end, while the Germans are fighting tooth and nail on the Eastern Front, really fatalistically knowing at least families can get out, at least civilians can get out. So I think that plays, I would agree with you, that plays into why this is happening.
That's right. Yep.
But talking about fanatics, I don't know if it's fair quite to say fanatics for the next group, but we see Buck escape, right? So let's talk about that for a minute. Not saying Buck's a fanatic, it's what comes after that. So Buck escapes in what I think is a completely fictionalized recounting.
It is. And he, in Don Miller's book, it just said, he escaped somewhere between, during one of the marches in the confusion. Could have been during an attack like we were talking about earlier. Who knows? And then Buck's motivation was, and a lot of the POWs, as they were marching, they thought, oh man, the SS, they were marching us towards the Alps, where the SS is now going to dig in and fight to the last man, and we're going to be stuck there with them. And so that was his motivation to, I want to get out of here. Same with Bucky, but Bucky was one of, if folks remember, as they get to a new place, the lieutenant colonel who's in charge of the senior ranking American officer for the POWs, and he says to one of the guys, like, hey Bob, go make sure we got a place to sleep, and hey Tim, go over here. That Bucky was one of those people. And so he was kind of one of the senior guys with a job to do, and that is why he did not go with Buck.
Right. And hearing that story, I feel like to some extent Bucky was could have been portrayed a little bit differently, because I feel like of the two of them, Bucky had the more devil may care attitude, and he was every bit the stand-up leader that Buck was. And to think he had an opportunity but said, no, I have to stay here and take care of my responsibilities, that's a lot of character.
Yeah, I think so. And I think they had probably been talking about let's escape or let's try, and the moment presented itself, and Buck took it. And I don't think, Bucky never blamed him at all for it. Nobody ever had ill will with him. So it is the three folks who are portrayed who do escape. But in the night, that first night, as they're kind of running away from the confusion, they get separated from George. And we'll talk about the scene here in a second. Right. George does die, but Buck hears about it later. He doesn't know. They just get separated. He doesn't see him again.
Yeah. And I just, something to touch on. It's not that unreasonable for them to think they're being marched into the Alps, because a huge part of our ground strategy or our operational design at the end of the war was based on the idea that a lot of our leaders thought the SS were going to consolidate in the Alps in, what did they call it? The redoubt.
That's right.
And we were going to end up fighting 6 more months, another year, against these hardcore Nazi fanatics in the Alps. Yeah. So it was something that was part of the zeitgeist, if you will. That's so right. not that unreasonable. But to your point, the three, including Buck, escape. George gets separated. What we actually see in the show is they're together. And who are these youngsters that end up killing George?
Yeah, so they're the Volkssturm, or the People's Army is what it was. So at this point, we saw another scene earlier as they're marching, and they're told, hey, get off the road, here come some soldiers. And it's old men and kids. And that is exactly what happened, because they're out of, military age males at this point, or they're already engaged in fighting, captured or dead.
Yeah.
And so they need young kids and old men to start picking up weapons and fighting. And so that is what happens. And these young kids are given weapons and told, hey, go defend the fatherland. And let's think about it. These boys, let's call them 16 years old. So it's 1945. I'm just going to make up that number, right? So they're 16. So it's 1945. So they were born in 1929, right? So their whole life has been under really the Nazi regime. And they probably went to Hitler Youth. More than likely they were a part of that. They were part of that kind of that culture that, were tough, that militaristic, the fascism aspects of it. And now their country's been at war for half their life, and now they have an opportunity to do something about it. And it's probably, if that's how George died, I don't know, wasn't able to discover that is true, but not out of the realm of possibility, not a fantasy scene,
right?
Where these young kids, they've been indoctrinated with this. Here is the enemy. Here's my chance, and then of course they're horrified and it's awful.
Yeah, they're not well trained, and it's that horrible combination of hyped up on indoctrination and terrified and young, right?
Yeah.
So I think the way they played out the scene, I was good with even knowing it wasn't true, because again, if we're trying to show an aspect of the war, which is one other thing I'd add to what your spot on description is, very likely these kids have spent a fair number of years, at least a year and a half now, being bombed on a fairly regular basis by these guys. So, if you go back to that scene in London with the mother crying out for her child, I don't necessarily think it would be any different if it was Britain, if it was the United States, and it got to the point where we're giving teenagers and old men rifles and telling them, do your best.
Yeah, that's right.
But ultimately, Buck makes it home. And how did that happen in actuality? It's a little bit glossed over.
So as shown, they're picked up by the Allies, by American Army, and he is sent back. And that was not, he hops out of a B-17, and that was not unheard of. If that it doesn't describe it in Miller's book, and I couldn't find exactly how he made it back to Thorpe Abbas, but he did. And if he hopped out of the B-17, that is completely plausible, and those things did happen where they would fly bombers into Paris, collect POWs, and then bring them back to England. And so he hops out, and then there he is.
Right, and he's home, and they put him back on flight status, which I assume he did fly some more missions afterwards.
He did not.
He did not.
He did not. He begged and tried his darndest, and they just told him, no, you're not going to do it.
I can see that from an administrative point of view. Like, you've not flown an airplane in 18 months, buddy. This isn't going to happen. But I can't imagine being the CO and telling a guy who went through all that, sure, we're going to let you fly missions because you could still get shot down and die. Like, I wouldn't want to lose a guy we'd gotten back like that to something like that. So I understand it.
Yeah, no matter how badly. And what really happened when he gets back to Thorpe Abbott, everybody's just amazed.
Yeah.
And he is there later in the officers club regaling everybody, the center of attention as he and Bucky were, and still the kind of heart and soul of the place, even though he hasn't been there in a year and a half, was still remembered. And now he's legendary status, really. And then because they won't let him fly, he heads home. He heads back to the States.
So he heads home before VE Day.
Yes.
Okay. So we'll talk about that with a little end scene, and right. Yeah. So we're seeing as this episode wraps up, we're diverging from reality, but we want to have a little bit of a feel good in, and we'll talk about our feelings on that at the end. But meanwhile, back in Germany, so to speak, that sounds so dramatic. Meanwhile, back in Nazi Germany, Bucky is still with the prisoner column, and they get to Stalag 7B, which notably is multinational.
It is.
And I think I may be making too much of it or giving too much credit, but I felt like they did a really good job of conveying the race politics and relations of the time with some of the looks between the colonial prisoners, meaning the colonies of France and England, and the Tuskegee Airmen. That's right. Yep. Because it's, people don't think about it, but there were Jamaican fighter pilots in the RAF. There were, Black South African fighter pilots in the RAF. There were, Zouaves? That may be the wrong term, but the Moroccan and Arab forces that fought for the French. There's all these different groups. And I think it was just, the Americans do this too. And I think that was a little bit different. And I felt that conveyed there. So I thought that was pretty neat. Yeah, I thought it was good. And I thought it showed very well. And that's what it was. Because as all of these Stalags and Stalag Lufts are being collapsed down and people are being they're moving their prisoners further and further to the west, they converge on this one. And a camp that was, I think, supposed to hold about 20,000 ends up holding north of 100,000. Right. POWs. That was something I read doing some research this week, was that because the numbers are staggering, right? We don't, the numbers of POWs are staggering. And I want to say there were 35,000 U.S. airmen that were POWs during the war in Europe. And fully 25,000 of those were 8th Air Force. Yeah. So just an amazing number. But they come to this Stalag, and they're not there for very long when they're liberated. And let's talk about the scene, and then let's talk about reality, because I know you and I talked about it before we started recording, and I think we both have our feelings on this one as far as the fiction versus fact. Yep. Okay. So what we see is, there's an air attack. P-51 comes by, takes a pot shot at the guard tower. As a pilot, I liked how the strafing was, although kind of on the mark, was a little all over the place, which is kind of how it is, especially if you're coming in a low grazing angle. So I appreciated the realism. He didn't shoot the guard and the guard fall out of the tower and everybody cheers. No. There's kind of a little bit of
frag pattern there, which is accurate. So I appreciated that aspect of it.
Yeah.
And then that happens, and then now tanks started rolling out of the woods, and now there's this concentrated American force that is coming to liberate the POWs. There's a fight that happens. The prisoners kind of rise up, tackle the guards, take them out. There's a bit of fighting there. And then we see Bucky running around, sees the Nazi flag. He's going to take it down and put the American flag up. And it's a great scene. He gets up there, puts up the American flag, and, lots of cheers.
Right. But that's not actually what happened.
No, it's parts of it.
Parts of it, yeah.
Yeah. But other parts, not as much.
Right. And we'll talk about that in our opinions at
Sure.
the end. Because, we alluded to it. We both have some feelings on that. And finally, Bucky, though they don't show it, he gets home, and we get what now clearly I would believe is the apocryphal reunion between Buck and Bucky.
That's right.
Though we could talk at the end, this was not the end of their relationship with one another.
No.
And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So Bucky's back. We're at Thorpe Abbott's, and let's go back to Crosby near the beginning of the episode. Sorry to do the time jump on everyone and rewind a little bit here. And Crosby's doing his thing. He seems to have fit into his groove, and he has that conversation with Rosie. We can touch on that for a little bit. You alluded to it earlier.
Yeah, so Crosby, he's worried, the weight of it all is really hitting him and everybody knows it's in the end game. Mm-hmm. And what's it going to be like when he goes home and how they've all changed. And let's not forget, when they got there, Rosie was 22 years old.
Yeah.
And what's not talked about in any of the episodes, which I think does Crosby a disservice, is he kept flying. Now, it wasn't a lot, but he was still flying missions. He led the first shuttle mission into Russia. Mm-hmm. So, as we saw him, I think the second or third episode, the shuttle mission down to North Africa, and then they started doing them into the Soviet Union, where they would go bomb a target, land there, refuel, rearm, and then come back in the other direction. So he was still flying, and very much a part of it, bombing Berlin. He's doing all the planning for it. Now he's a senior officer, doing a lot of leadership roles, and the weight of what has happened, of all the killing and dying, and what kind of man is he now, and what kind of father is he going to be? And he's really wrestling with this. I am not the same person that I was when I left, and who am I now because of all of this circumstance?
Yeah, I'm going to go home and be a father, and what am I? What have I spent essentially the entirety of my adulthood to now doing?
Yeah,
killing in mass from the air.
Yep.
Yeah, but Rosie is able to give a whole different perspective.
He is. He tells them, hey, they got what's coming to them, and we were here to do a job. And yeah, it's a horrible, awful job, but it's a job, and it needed to be done. And I think Rosie takes that to heart.
And that was an actual conversation, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So that there was no messaging there. That happened.
Yeah.
Right.
What were the exact words were? Who knew?
Sure, but
doesn't matter.
That's part of doing history.
They were very, very close and had those kinds of conversations with one another.
Yeah.
And became really good friends.
Yeah. And then we see Crosby react to the parachute shot being locked. And there's just, for me, there was no context. And I put my own military naval spin on it. Like, I think I know what was going on here, but what was that all about?
So I think this was about, first of all, I think it got cut. It's on the editing room floor somewhere,
yeah.
Right? Or in the script, scrap heap.
Yeah.
There was some backstory that did not get explained at all.
Yeah.
But what it was, these guys are getting ready to go on a mission. They can't do it. So they go to Crosby because he's one of the leaders of the group. He's one of the senior officers in the group now. And he goes in, gets them their gear, goes and finds the guy who's in charge of the gear locker, who's, having breakfast and doesn't care about his job. And, Crosby rightly explodes at the guy, freaks out. There's kind of a back and forth. And again, I thought it was disingenuous. Crosby says, hey, I guess you've never been over Berlin without a parachute. Mm-hmm. And the guy's like, well, what about you, Crosby? Well,
Yeah.
he had flown missions to Berlin.
Right.
So I thought that, again, I thought maybe a slip up in the script there. But I think what they're trying to convey is, at this point of the war, there are those who've come over where it hasn't been quite as dangerous. And people were, if you read the book, the people are coming over, getting their 25 missions within a month and a half.
Yeah.
And it gets bumped up, and there was an episode about that. It gets bumped up, and it gets bumped up again because it's just happening so fast. And it's not a punishment or anything. It's like, golly, they're doing it so fast, and our op tempo is so high that it's just dumb to have these highly trained, experienced people go home. We're just going to keep them here.
Yeah. I think the number got to 50 at some point, maybe.
Yeah. And so we're just going to keep them here for the duration of the war, especially in 1945.
Yeah.
But it's not that. It's still dangerous. They're still losing bombers. Don't get me wrong. Still awful, but certainly not like what it was like when Crosby first got there. And I think it's showing, hey, kind of to use a modern term, the Fobbit mentality.
Yeah.
Those who are back there.
It's okay. It doesn't matter.
It's okay. It's fine. Whatever.
Yeah.
I'm getting my steak and eggs every day. And
Yeah.
everything's grand. And here I am at war, and people are freaking out all the time.
So
whereas Crosby has really seen it. He's seen it from the very beginning, and lets the guy have it.
And he knows that it doesn't matter if it's the last week of the war. I'm not saying that was the last week, but it could be the last day of the war. You could be the last guy to die in the war, and you don't want to be in that plane without your parachute.
Yep.
Go do your job, Fobbit.
Yeah, go do your job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we go from there, and we sort of have this completely fictional reunion of everybody, and it's a feel-good moment, but it's based around some real events, which were Operations Mana for the Brits and Chow Hound for the Americans. What were those?
So although the Allies are pushing east into Germany, they still had not cleared out a pocket in Holland, which was held by this absolutely fanatical and dug-in SS group who just were going to fight to the last man. But because the Allies had completely surrounded it, now those civilians who are literally trapped inside there with them are starving, and there's not enough food. There's no medical supplies. And the Allies find out about it, and so now there's this kind of back and forth with the German military between the Allies of, hey, we're going to fly in aid, and we're going to fly in food and medical, and we want to airdrop it, and we aren't going to bomb anything, but to do this, to make sure the food gets there, we have to come in at very low altitude. You need to not fire at us, and that's true. Like, they didn't really get an answer back from the SS. And they kind of gambled that, okay, that this truce is going to happen because, it's also going to benefit the SS troops.
Of course, because some of that's going to fall where the Germans are going to get it. And,
that's right.
And so, that was those two operations, and it was horrible. It was a horrible winter in Holland. It was a very brutal winter as far as weather, and a little bit of a tie-in that again, maybe we'll sit down and go, this is the way to watch Band of Brothers and The Pacific and Masters of the Air in order, right? All these things. Yeah. This is a direct follow-on to the episodes that were they culminated in the island for Band of Brothers. I forget the name of the episode before that, but Market Garden and what came after. And exactly as you said, after Market Garden fails, which is shown multiple books in the movie A Bridge Too Far, after that fails, the British, Montgomery decides, well, we're just going to bypass that.
That's right.
We'll get Antwerp eventually and get the port, but they bypass it. And the first thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the local commander in Holland, in the Netherlands, basically ordered the leveling of the city of Arnhem after the battle, shown in A Bridge Too Far. Mm-hmm. And the Germans went a little bit scorched earth because they felt almost betrayed by the Dutch behavior. Right. Now, that's totally unreasonable. The Dutch were in no way ever allied to the Germans, other than, everyone had their own, traitors in the fifth column. problems and such. But it was a brutal, brutal winter, as shown in those, and that was really the backstory of why this was so bad. Obviously, there's hunger all over. It's war, but there was mass starvation.
Yeah,
People
exactly
on the
right.
edge of mass starvation. Interestingly, I came across the little tidbit that I'm gonna blank on her name. Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Oh
The
my
actress.
gosh! And
I'm gonna have to. I can't believe I had it all in my notes, and oh, people are gonna hate me here, right? Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn was
Hepburn, good
actually
Lord.
she lived in Arnhem during part of this time, and she was actually part of this. Like that's
Oh my
where she
gosh.
grew up. Yeah, yeah. So a little tidbit, even though I couldn't remember her name, right there. Sorry about that. So we see all the guys get in the plane, and we'll talk about that in our feelings later. They do the food drop, and I can't imagine the flowers were there. I know the Dutch are renowned for tulips, but
That is 100% accurate.
is it really?
That happened.
Okay, that's
That
awesome.
happened.
Yeah,
Yep.
uh,
And reported
wow.
by many crew.
Yeah,
So it happened.
that's really neat. That's
Yeah.
so even in the midst of all that, the time to and effort to do that, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. But of course, that's sort of we're just about there, right? So we get VE Day, victory in Europe, and it's appropriately understated, right? You know, we don't get a big thing. We get a little bit of a montage, and everyone's happy, and okay, you know, we've wrapped this up, and then we have the departure. The departure, with what you've told me now, is completely an act of fiction as opposed to who was there. And beyond that, at least in my mind, I thought we left a lot of the B-17s just sitting there as scrap. I don't think we flew huge
Yeah, I
numbers of
could
them
not
home,
figure
did
out
we?
how there are many that came back, and then eventually ended up out in the boneyard and
Right.
then sold for scrap out of Arizona. And there were, I mean, hundreds of airplanes that they just torched and gave to the Brits or whomever for scrap after they took kind of the sensitive and
Yeah.
equipment out of them and then just got rid of them. And then for the most people came home on what was called Operation Magic Carpet, which was let's bring everybody back home. And the 8th Air Force, we've been following the 100th Bomb Group, and those who've seen Band of Brothers, we get a very tight shot group on Easy Company. But there were, at the end of the war, there were just over 3 million American men and women service members who were over there in Europe.
Right.
And Operation Magic Carpet was, okay, how do we get everybody back
Right.
to the States?
Because it's
And it
taken
took-
years to get all these people here.
Yeah. And it took, I think, February of 46 is when they finally finished it for Europe. And there was some occupation and things like that.
Of course, some guys stand behind.
But yeah, this huge, major logistical movement that they had started planning for in 1943, in late 43.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
No, all
Sorry to
good.
go down
That's
that
no,
rabbit
I know. I think it's interesting. So that's the end of the show, and then we get the closing montage of
Yep.
what happened to some of the key players, which I thought was nice. Me and my title cards, and we didn't get that until this episode. We got dates, we got names at the bottom throughout the episode. We got the end title cards, and I thought they were terrific. I thought
it was
that just
magnificent.
having that closed out, finding out that Bucky died untimely early, but had been so close with Buck.
That's right.
Even though he died early, it was just a nice tie-in. There's a nice little parallel with Lewis and Nixon or Lewis Nixon and it's not
Dick
my
Winters.
night for Band of Brothers and the Dick Winters. So nice little tie-in there. So, all right, should we do closing thoughts on the episode and then discuss thoughts on the entire series?
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So you go for it, Roger.
Yeah. So I like this episode, even as much as I disliked episode 8. I really like this episode. I don't think it was my favorite, And that's only because I am a historian, and I bristle a little bit when we fictionalize things, even to get a point across. When we're telling the story of real people, so not my favorite episode, but I think a very solid episode. I liked that we gave enough time to each of the characters' story arcs.
Mm-hmm.
There's some things I dislike, but I think I'll talk about them in the entire series. Beyond that, fictional versus non-fictional. I really don't understand why they changed the escape story. I guess I understand why they did the we're all going to get together and go on the food drop. It sort of feels good, but I don't think that having them all there really, it didn't tie things up for me the way hearing about them after the war did.
Yeah.
But all in all, I'm going to give this episode a solid 4.2.
Oh, wow. Okay. Gotcha. So before I give my rating, my parents were here over the weekend, and I watched this episode with my dad, Rear Admiral Bad Fred Lewis, and he gave it a 5.0.
Okay.
So this was his favorite episode.
Nice.
So I just had to throw that in there because he knew we were going to talk.
Oh, you wouldn't tell me the Admiral gave it a 5.0 before my 4.2. Great.
Tell Roger, I give it a 5.0.
Yeah.
Okay, so for mine, I agree. I gave it a 4.9.
Okay.
The only reason that I thought it was a phenomenal episode, I can't even remember what I gave the first couple of the, were very, very high, but I really like how it tied together. The only reason for me it wasn't a 5.0 was because, again, just some of the historical inaccuracies that I didn't think needed to be there, to be perfectly honest. And then how Don Miller ends his book with Buck and Bucky would have been a much better ending, in my opinion. And I'll tell it here in a second after I give Zoe's rating. So for me, I'm sorry, go ahead, Roger.
I was just going to say, give everyone spoiler alert in case they haven't read the book and they want to.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's right. So so mine was a 4.9.
Yeah.
Again, just some of the fictionalization of it, I did not think needed to be there.
Yeah.
But man, that opening sequence, holy smokes, was awesome, awful, terrifying.
Yeah.
So well done. It was great. Okay, so Zoe gave it a 4.8.
Okay.
She thought it was good. She really liked although hated it, right? But she really liked the portrayal of the concentration camp and the acting that happened there, and how now it's seen and how awful and horrific it was. But her detractor was it did not, although it was a great episode and well put together, much better than episode 8, she said.
Yeah.
For her, even though at the end, I mean, I was getting teary-eyed at the end, but for her, she was just a stone cold killer. She just was like, yeah, it didn't have the emotional punch. I didn't cry. And she'd shed tears in other episodes. And I was like, how did you not cry during that?
So here's a little, I think I'm going to hazard a guess, right? So you have gone to war. Now, neither of us have gone to war the degree these guys did, right? But there's a camaraderie and there's a shared hardship.
Yes.
And I felt the same way at the end that you did, right? Like it was getting a little dusty, right, in the Roger household. And I remember the feeling of coming home from a deployment, which is one thing, but so when I deployed to Iraq the first time, I was part of sort of an individual augmentee battalion that got put together, and then I further got assigned to an army unit. And when we left, it was like full tempo ops till 2 days before we left. Pack everything up, take the C-130s to Kuwait, get to Kuwait. I went back with the Navy. I had made some great friends, and it was a rapid fire. You are leaving, boom. Yeah. And that's what that evoked for me. Is like those guys shared so much, for some of them for so long, shared such hardship, and now even though you want to be home, you are leaving this place, and you are probably never coming back, and you are never going to be a part of this organization again, the way it was. And for me at least, that is what that evoked for me.
Yep. Yeah, you're exactly right. So anyway, so there are the ratings.
There are the ratings, and okay, so apparently you don't want your show rated by me. I'm the grumpy, slow, difficult rater here. Let's talk about the series as a whole, and I
Okay.
will say I am using Band of Brothers as the benchmark. I don't think we have seen anything convey history as compellingly and as well as Band of Brothers. And it's a little unfair because how do you do aviation versus the guys in Pacific?
Yeah.
But in any case, so I said at the beginning, I was hoping the show was going to be more greater than the sum of its parts. And so for me, it was. And I'm going to give
Yeah.
the entire show a 4.6, which is
Oh, wow.
higher than any
Yeah.
individual rating I've given during the season. And I'll give the goods and the bads for me. So
Okay.
for me, the goods, which outweighed the bads, and we won't go into episode 8, the goods were I felt like if you're watching this, you get the feeling of the cocksure Buck and Bucky, and we're gonna go do this, and even getting to Greenland is a lot harder than we thought
Yeah,
it was going to be.
that's right.
And to the oh my god horrors, I thought that the pacing, as we talked about earlier in previous episodes, of mission focused episode, home episode, mission focused episode, that worked for me. Like that's what these guys went through. Terror during the day, come home, get drunk, chase girls, whatever you were doing, wash, rinse, repeat. And
Yep.
so that worked for me. We touched on all the things that, we touched on what we'd call PTSD now, or being flak happy. We maybe went a little more than we needed to with Sandra, but I think we touched on the human connection thing. We got the a little bit of the Brit versus the American. So we're hitting on all these cylinders. The things that would have made it better for me, and of course, we totally underserved the Tuskegee Airmen, right? So there's number one. Like,
Yep.
I almost don't want to think about that portion of this, and go, Apple, HBO, somebody, as much as I want you to make the nautical, equivalent
That's right.
to
That's
this,
the next natural progression.
like
Right.
as much as I want Destroyermen off the Battle off Samar, Mr. Hanks, if you're listening,
Yeah.
technical advisor, as much as I want that, give us the Tuskegee Airmen. Give us that. But beyond that, I felt that they missed the opportunity, because they started so well, to do the little nuances of how it got easier. So what I mean by that, it became easier in chunks. And we talked about, well, we stopped painting bombers. We stopped painting fighters because it didn't matter anymore. Like, we were becoming so supreme, and I'm not using a different word for a very specific purpose. We became so supreme in the air, the weight of the paint wasn't worth it to put on the planes. And in fact, we had upgunned, right? I sort of wish we'd seen the G models to show we're having to throw even more guns on these. Well, by the end of the war, they're not flying with as many guns. They're taking guns out to save fuel. They're taking waste gunners out because they don't need them. And I felt like we could have seen a progression there that showed, man, we suffered, and then we sort of got over the hump, and it was still a slog to victory, and we didn't see that. I wish we'd seen that. And I do wish we'd seen a little more discussion of fighter escorts and of the Germans that came up, like with the Messerschmitt 262s, the 163 rocket fighters. But overall, I think it was a very solid effort. So if I take Band of Brothers as a 5, this was 4.6 for me.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna have to agree with you on that. My scores are 4.6 as well. Exactly, for all the things that you said, including
I stole your
the
thunder.
positives.
I'm sorry.
No, and the detractors. Completely agree about the Tuskegee Airmen, and I want to see the next progression of the Navy in the Pacific. That's what I want to see next, personally.
Right.
But I will say, for a positive as a whole, and I think we may have touched on this in one of the first raids that we saw in episode 1 and episode 2. Like, man, nobody has seen something like this since it actually happened.
Yeah.
No movie, no show has portrayed it like this. The realism, how awful it was. What's it like to fight in this alien environment? The scale and scope, how fast it all happens, the terror. we just have not seen that portrayed anywhere.
I mean, 12
since
o'clock
it actually
high.
happened.
Yeah, 12 O'Clock High, the movie, which I mean, I'm sure you've seen. It was a leadership movie for the Navy, and it's just a great flick. That showed the psychological toll, but it really didn't show the flying the way this did, to your point.
That's right. Yeah.
And
like the formations and things like that. And I mean, the attention to detail that they made throughout the entire show. And my dad made a comment. He was like, man, when they're sitting there, when Crosby and Rosie are having their conversation, they're drinking Coke out of glass bottles. There's Coca-Cola bottles.
Yeah.
There, that were the same shape as 1940s
Right.
Coca-Cola bottles.
And I mean, you can get those now, right? But they're the little tiny ones. And that's nice attention to detail.
So all of it was. And then you just brought up a great point about attention to detail. In that scene, did you notice it, Roger? What was on the mantle? What was on the mantle?
I did. Good point. It was the Stein. It was the robber Stein from 12 O'Clock High. That was awesome.
The Robin Hood Stein.
Yeah. That was
and I don't know
nice.
if that was thrown in there. Like
that had to be known. That had to be a little nod to that.
But as soon as they cut to it, I was like, "Holy cow!"
That's what that is. Yeah.
That's it. Anyway, sorry to detract.
No, all good.
Well, you tend to detail, but again, we've never seen certainly as an audience member, and there's so many nuances and so many discussion points that you and I have had, so many layers to it, and it's so complex. I can't wait to go back and watch it again and pick up.
Right.
We talked about 1% of everything that was in every episode. I can't wait to go back and see the 99% that I missed.
And binge it, right? Like to get 2 or 3 in a row. Now, what's funny, I don't think we've told anyone that we found out in the discussions we had outside of filming. You and I, this is not our first collaboration, so to speak, though we didn't realize it at the time. Why do I bring this up? It is because you're talking about we've never seen anything on this scale before. So I'm going to tell the story just as a relationship to that and to show what a small place the military could be. Boyle and I were talking at one point. I said, when I was doing my department head tour, let me set the stage. Whenever a carrier strike group and an amphibious ready group get ready to go on deployment, if you're East Coast, you come down here off the coast of North Carolina. And what's the country called? See, I don't remember because I don't really care as a SWO, right? It's just whatever piece of land they're calling it that I'm off of. What's
the one I always think I'm going to get it wrong, but when you go to the basic school, you're fighting Centralia.
Yeah.
Those damn Centralians.
Damn Centralians.
So any fake enemy to me is always Centralia. So.
I'm less highbrow than you, so I'm putting it on the record. The naval officer is less highbrow than the Marine Corps officer because I keep coming back to Krablakistan, which is I think from The Simpsons. But
that's right.
There's some name for it. But in any case, we had been doing gunfire support training practice, mock gunfire support off this amphibious invasion line on my ship, and I came up to the bridge after a watch and see. And I was telling Boyle, and this was the summer before 9/11, so there's sort of this halcyon, we're masters of the sea, if you will.
That's right.
Sort of feeling. And I remember looking, and there's fibs, little fibs, might have been LCACs, might have been Mike boats going into the shore. I can see the the LSD and the LPD within range, and I think it was Boxer was vaguely on the horizon. There's Sea Cobras, there's Marine Cobras going in really low, and 46s delivering guys. There's Harriers making runs. There's F-18s from the Teddy Roosevelt, which is over the horizon. And we're talking maybe a dozen to 20 planes at a time. And I'm just thinking, man, this is who's going to mess with us, right? There's 12 of these in our Navy, and this is just one. And I bring this up thinking I'm awestruck by 20 planes and 4 ships and a dozen helicopters, because it was pretty impressive to see. But these guys were launching 1,000-plane raids.
Oh yeah.
By the end of the war.
By the end, it was routine.
Right. But I'm sort of relating this to Boyle, and Boyle says to me,
I say to you, I was flying one of those in August of 01, and that was my very first section lead flight, where I was leading a section off the ship, and I remember flying above it and seeing all of this going ashore. You could see all the ships out there doing their thing. You can see all the AVs and the LCACs moving ashore. And I remember from my perspective, I'm like, holy cow, this is a lot of firepower
Yeah.
down there. And
Yeah.
I hope I don't screw up.
Yeah, right.
It's my first
So,
day leading.
first sex leader flight, but
Yeah.
it does make you sort of take pause, and so I can only imagine you're up there seeing that, and then you think about the D-Day scenes, and it's like,
Yeah.
You hear guys say it almost brought a tear to their eye, and I get that. I don't think that was. I think that was very literal. It is just such a powerful and moving thing to see that many people. It's not the machines, but that many people acting in concert
Yep.
to achieve a
Right.
goal.
Yeah,
So
for sure.
sorry, here's been your off-topic Zen
No.
moment with Boyle and Roger there. But I when we told each other that, I thought it was just crazy because we did not know each other until we had a mutual acquaintance pair us up to discuss some of the other stuff we're doing in the podcast, and then we decided to do this. I just thought, what a crazy small Navy.
Yeah, what a
and Marine
crazy
Corps.
small world. Yeah.
Yeah. So so you and I are both at 4.6s. Did
Yes.
Zoe have feelings on the overall show?
You know, I didn't even ask her. So we're just going to have to leave that hanging, I think,
Okay.
for our follow-on
Wrap-up?
episode
Yeah.
that we're going to do
Yeah.
about reviewing kind of the combined bomber offensive. So we
Mhm.
followed the 100th Bomb Group through, and now Roger and I, we're going to do an episode
Yep.
about the kind of operational level, strategic level, and we're going to discuss some of those pros and cons and what was the wider war looking like in the air from the air
Right.
perspective.
Yeah. So we'll probably take a couple weeks to do that. We probably won't be keeping this cadence of every week, but we want to put something good together for you guys and fill in the blanks and give some of that nuance, and we'll be back with you with that in a couple weeks. But Boyle, I would just like to say thank you for your time in doing this.
Of course.
I've greatly enjoyed Master of the Air, and it's been even better because I've been able to look forward to having this discussion about it every week.
Same with me, Roger. First of all, thank you for inviting me to do this. This has been a highlight of the last 9 weeks for me. Every single week I get super excited
come
about
on, man. You've had a couple things happen the
I've
past
had a couple
9
things
weeks.
happen at the time as well, but well
Yeah.
and truly,
Mhm.
being able to do it, being able to get your outline, dig into it, and then it's been fascinating. Just our thought process, like you research one aspect, I research one. We haven't even talked about that, and when we come together,
Mhm.
we are examining different aspects of things, and our conversations have been absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
And I do have to say, you know, in closing, for me as a father, being able to watch this with my youngest daughter has been really, really
Yeah.
special as well. And in fact, when my dad was here, I was like, "Hey, honey, come watch it with me and Papa," and she was like, "No, that's our thing that we do together."
Yeah.
And she's like, "So watch it with your dad, but then I just wanted
And
to
watch
be
it
you and
again
me."
with, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
You
That's
and me.
awesome, man.
So that's been really special. So I think we're
Yeah.
going to pick up Band of Brothers here in a couple weeks.
There you go. Yeah, because, of course, yeah, Band of Brothers is older than she is, man. We're getting
Yeah.
old, man.
That's right.
All
But
right.
it's been
Well,
phenomenal, Roger. Thank you so much.
yeah. Hey, I can't thank you enough. So, and everyone who's watching, thank you for watching.
Absolutely.
Hope you've enjoyed it. And like I said, we'll be back in a couple weeks, and we'll give you our take on the combined bomber offensive.
Sounds great.
All right.